Good morning. My name is Carlos Henrique. I'm the head of the Trade Investment Bureau of the Embassy. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Brazil-UK Fintech Forum initiative celebrating innovation, cross-border collaboration, and the strengthening of ties between Brazil and the United Kingdom. A few housekeeping notes. There is no fire alarm test scheduled for this morning, so if you hear anything, please follow the embassy staff. The event is being recorded, and selected highlights will be shared through the embassy's official channels. You can access the full program and speaker bios by scanning the QR codes on the back of your badges. We have 4 panels scheduled for today. Each one will last about 45 minutes, with a few minutes for Q&As if our moderators judge it will be possible. To officially open today's session, please allow me the honor to invite His Excellency Ambassador Antônio Patriota, Ambassador of Brazil to the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos Henrique. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the Embassy of Brazil for the first Brazil-UK Fintech Forum. This event is part of a broader series of initiatives celebrating 200 years of diplomatic relations between Brazil and the United Kingdom this year. Such occasions offer us the opportunity to reflect on our long-standing partnership, but also to look ahead and focus on the future we want to build together. Few sectors reflect that future better than financial technology known as Fintech. The Fintech industry is dynamic, fast-moving, and fundamentally borderless. It connects ideas, talent, and capital in powerful new ways. And it presents enormous opportunities for innovation, inclusion, and economic growth in both our countries and beyond. Brazil today is home to one of the most vibrant fintech ecosystems in the world. According to AB Fintechs, Brazil has over 1,500 active fintech startups, making it the largest fintech market in Latin America and the 5th largest globally. The sector has grown by more than 30% over the past 5 years, fueled by a young, tech-savvy population, widespread mobile internet access, and a strong culture of entrepreneurship. Economic figures illustrate the importance of this sector. Brazil's fintechs attracted over £2.8 billion in investment in 2022 alone, despite a challenging global financial environment. Instant payments, especially through the revolutionary Pix system, launched by Brazil's central bank in 2020, have fundamentally transformed the financial landscape in Brazil. As of 2024, Pix is used by over 70% of the adult population in the country, facilitating more than 3 billion transactions every month. Moreover, Fintech has become a driving force for financial inclusion in Brazil. Around 16 million people access the financial system for the first time through digital solutions, dramatically reducing the population without access to financial services and empowering small businesses and underserved communities. The United Kingdom, on the other hand, is a global hub for finance, investment, and innovation, as we're all aware. According to Innovate Finance, the UK remains the 2nd largest fintech market in the world, with the sector valued at around £11 billion. London, in particular, is home to over 2,500 fintech firms, and the UK government continues to promote an environment that fosters regulatory innovation, talent development, and global leadership. We strongly believe there's huge potential to bring these two ecosystems even closer together. Brazilian fintechs can benefit from the UK's expertise in scaling internationally such areas as open banking and ESG-focused financial services. British fintechs, meanwhile, have an incredible opportunity to tap into Brazil's dynamic and expanding market, as well as Brazilian creativity, a gateway to Latin America and beyond. And this is precisely the purpose of today's Brazil-UK Fintech Forum, to hear from experts, to exchange ideas, and to explore opportunities for collaboration between Brazilian and British fintech communities. I would like to take a moment to sincerely thank all the speakers and moderators who are here with us today. Your presence and insights will make the conversation truly meaningful. I would also like to express our gratitude to our partners who made this event possible, the Department for Business and Trade, represented by Katie Ramsey, Head of Fintech at DBT. Innovate Finance, responsible for this week's Fintech Week, represented by CEO Janine Hurt. The Brazilian Fintech Association, AB Fintechs, represented by CEO Diego Perez. And the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce in Great Britain, with Chair Vera Innes and Deputy Chair Carla Ferreira. Your support and collaboration have been invaluable. Finally, I encourage all of you to take advantage of the connections and networking opportunities throughout the morning. Some of the most exciting ideas and partnerships can often start over a cup of coffee. Thank you once again for joining us. Let's build the future together. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Ambassador. We will begin the first panel discussion entitled Market Opportunities and Entry Strategies. This session will explore growth potential and strategic approaches for Brazilian and British fintechs expanding internationally. Please welcome our moderator, Carla Ferreira, Vice Chair of the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce in Great Britain, and our distinguished panelists, Carlos Urrutia from Revolut, Chris Mayo, Head of Primary Markets from the London Stock Exchange Group, Nadia Costanzo, Head of Banking and Expansion of Wise, and Mr. Vishal Dalal, CEO of Pismo. Thank you.
I'm really thrilled to be with you all today because we're going towards the end of another very successful UK FinTech Week, but also the first panel of the first Brazil UK FinTech Forum. And every time we talk about Brazil, we inevitably think about all those opportunities and characteristics that Ambassador Patriota just mentioned in terms of market size, relevance, and digitization. And I was really glad this week also to hear from Chancellor Rachel Reeves during Innovate Finance Global Summit, and a shout out here to Janine Hurt for another fantastic conference this week. And the Chancellor very much highlighted many opportunities to keep the UK at the forefront of fintech, of the fintech industry. And some of those initiatives are tied together with many others currently under development in Brazil via the Brazilian Central Bank under the leadership of Gabriel Calipolo, or in the Ministry of Finance with Minister Fernando Haddad. So here we have the opportunity to have with us today 3 top unicorns that are widely experienced in international expansion and also know about the peculiarities of doing business in the UK and in Brazil. And of course, because when we talk about market expansion, we inevitably think about capital. We have the London Stock Exchange to enlighten us a bit with capital strategies. So let us start here with Carlos. Carlos, when we think about Revolut and the decision that you guys made back in 2023 to enter the Latin American market, and you chose Brazil to be your first LatAm market, were those important features such as a big market, 200 million people, highly digitized, with a good infrastructure for innovations such as specs, were these relevant criteria in your decision to come to Brazil?
For sure. Thank you very much. So expansion is really at the core of what we do at Revolut. We have the ambition of being a global digital bank. And in order to do so, of course, we need to build technology to cross borders and be able to first obtain license to operate in new countries. Second, build our product in new countries in a systematic fashion, and then optimize that product in order to kind of get the right engagement and retention from our customers. When we were thinking about that second wave of expansion, because it was our second wave of expansion, the first one having been Singapore, Australia, Japan, and the US, we looked at Latin America with interest because of, I think, 3 fundamental reasons. The first one was regulatory openness, right? So when you look at the world and how the regulators approach licensing for new entrants, Latin America stands out because it is really open to grant licenses to foreign and national players with diverse levels of experience without much restrictions. If you look at Asia, it's a little bit different. You tend to see foreign ownership restrictions or prohibitive levels of minimum capital requirements, right? So that's the first element. The second element was, of course, a highly digitized population. And the third was an extremely dynamic and I would say fintech-obsessed market and population, right? Very much driven, I think, by the innovations that were created by the Brazilian Central Bank with PIX. And I would say with a set of regulations that are really at the global forefront of how to develop innovation and fintech ecosystems. So it was certainly kind of at the core of why we chose Brazil inside of Latin America, of course. And I mean, then there's the other obvious reasons: 200 million population and a kind of a higher middle income economy, the economic fundamentals being there.
I see, and I believe that for you, Nadia, when it comes to WISE, you also went through a very similar decision. But how do you compare your experiences in Brazil to other markets, particularly with your coverage in Africa, Middle East? How do you compare those markets?
Yeah, I would say in Brazil, so we entered Brazil a long time ago, around 2016. And I think when we entered, it was really about what problem can we solve there, obviously the opportunity as well, but it was really identifying that there was a huge gap in the provision of cross-border financial services that were cheap and affordable and transparent, right? And so when we went there, we saw that there was a huge demand actually for our services, because what Brazilians were seeing on the market is huge markups to their cross-border transfers, right? So actually, I would say we were actually quite surprised the amount of growth that we saw on the payments outbound from Brazil, right? And this is, I would say it stands out compared to some of the other markets that we're operating in terms of, you know, other regions and whatnot, just because I think we were solving such a core problem for Brazilians over there. So when you look at IOF, when you look at the markups, et cetera, and just the lack of provision of those services. So back when we came, you know, back in 2016 or so, there wasn't many providers that were on the ground. So I guess if you compare, I mean, it is quite comparable to other markets that I personally operate in, right? Emerging markets, you see these problems happening in a lot of places. But I think we were just able in Brazil to find a niche in terms of, okay, this is actually a problem that we're solving for Brazilians specifically that you didn't see in as many other markets. But I would say you continue to see that problem everywhere, right? I mean, I think the lack of transparency, the lack of speed, you know, all of those things, poor product offering in emerging markets is a general trend. And I think Brazil has obviously been at the forefront, especially in the Latin America region, but even globally, as you mentioned, in developing an ecosystem and an infrastructure that's going to be much more conducive to innovation and foreign companies coming in ultimately and bringing in higher quality products.
That's exactly what probably Pismo faced in the early days in Brazil, isn't it, Vishal? Because you guys made a kind of a different path, the alternative path. You were born in Brazil and then you expanded around the world. Tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. Exactly what you said. I think, you know, our journey has been slightly different in the sense that we are a Brazilian company that made it global eventually. And obviously the reason we were founded in Brazil, you know, are pretty well documented. You know, highly sophisticated financial infrastructure. The demographic was there, right, to sort of absorb the modern technology. And I think when it came to us deciding where our first international location would be, obviously we considered a whole lot of places, you know, the logical choices, the US, Europe, UK, Asia, right, which sort of tends to adopt these technologies much faster. But I think in the end, the UK made a lot of sense. One is obviously because of the location, right? It's the only place where you can actually really run a global firm from, right? You have access to the West Coast and, for example, as far afield as Japan and Australia. That's number one. I think the second thing is, you know, we are, in a sense, again, different from all of the others in the sense that we are a pure technology firm, right? We're not a financial institution in that sense. And so for us, what matters the most and is worth its weight in gold is technology talent, right? And that talent, right, to sort of be able to build a platform like that exists in about 2 or 3 locations in the world. Brazil is one of them. But the biggest is essentially everything within a 1,000-mile radius of this place, right? So all of that, including the accessibility, the sort of digital infrastructure, the location and the talent essentially, help make the choice easy. So for us, as you said, it was very different. It was a Brazilian company going global, and we sort of chose this as the springboard for going global.
Yeah, I think it translates well the idea of having UK as a springboard to reach markets around the world. And we talked a lot about American exceptionalism in the first half of the year. I think there is a London exceptionalism here, Chris, don't you think? And when it comes to capital, which is kind of essential to make these strategies work, how is the UK and the London Stock Exchange embracing this reality and offering strategies and opportunities for those fintech companies?
Thanks, Carla. And to say obrigado pelo convite to speak here today. So, London Stock Exchange, the way I'd like to kind of frame us is we are the world's oldest fintech. And, we're a truly international company. Just to give an example, I'm a guy from Manchester who lives in New York, spent most of my career in New York as an investment banker. We are the most international market in the world in terms of the proportion of international companies listed. Way more international than the US market. So, as an example, we also have a much more diverse investor base than the US market. So if you look at the composition of investors for UK listed companies, then it's about 30 to 40% US, 40% UK, and then obviously the rest from the rest of the world and Europe as well. So it's a much more international market. But what we're here to talk about today, we're talking about exciting growing companies here. What they need is capital, and we are the mechanism to allow companies to raise capital at true scale. Now, you can say private markets can do that, but they can only do that to a certain extent. And you can also say right now that there is a liquidity crisis from a private markets perspective, and the public markets is really the only way to solve that problem. And in particular, when you look at companies in the fintech space, and there are a lot of exceptional companies in the fintech space active in Brazil, but many of those are homegrown. A lot of those are VC backed, but many of those will be below $5 or $10 billion of valuation. At the moment, in the US, there really is no route to liquidity for companies of that size. You need to be a large company, definitely above $5 billion to go public in the US. Most of the companies in VC portfolios will be between a couple of $100 million and $5 billion of size. And that's where London really excels in terms of being a lower cost place with access to really high quality, actively managed, long-only institutions. The US does not have that at this kind of size range. But also, let's talk about Brazil as a capital market, because I spend a lot of time, I spoke in Portuguese earlier because my wife is from Brazil, so I spend a lot of time in Brazil, and I've studied the market there very closely. I think there's a really big opportunity to employ dual listing strategies with countries like Brazil, where you've got a London and Brazilian dual listing. You have a more diverse investor base geographically and also by investor type. Institutional, retail, especially allowing, individuals in Brazil to get access to really exciting homegrown companies where the UK can also provide the institutional capital to let those companies grow. I think this was true even before the kind of craziness we've had over the last few months with tariffs, but now that opportunity is even more acute. And so what we're going to be doing going forward is looking for those opportunities in Brazil and Latin America more broadly to provide capital and liquidity for VC investors and help them achieve returns going forward.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And when I think about companies like Revolut, at the moment is thinking about route to liquidity. How does the UK environment facilitate this for you?
Can you repeat it's thinking about what? Sorry.
About liquidity.
Liquidity. So I think liquidity in the UK was very important for Revolut at the outset. Probably less so at this stage of the company's development. So as you talk about UK exceptionalism when it comes to fintech, I mean, I think it's really remarkable that companies like Wise, Revolut, Monzo, Sterling Bank, I mean, many other fintechs were born here. Many very successful around the world and some kind of global darlings. That's not a coincidence, right? That happened because there was a regulatory framework that enabled startups to start operating with limited licenses, with small amounts of capital, managing risks from a regulatory perspective. So there are kind of guardrails to allow these companies to operate without kind of putting their customers at risk, but also to grow and become more complex with time and maybe even upgrade the level of the regulations. But also, there was access to capital. So there were important fintech-focused VCs, more kind of industry-agnostic VCs here, supporting these companies, and that's, of course, essential to their development. Revolut is currently, as a company, in a situation that is very different, right? We're kind of at a point in which we're self-sustaining and don't really have that need for additional access to capital for now. It doesn't mean that it won't happen later on, but that's kind of our current reality, right?
And then Vishal, please go ahead, Chris. Yes, of course.
I just wanted to say one more thing about liquidity, because obviously, there's another interpretation of this. Companies the size of Revolut and companies which have received a lot of private capital, many of their employees especially will be looking for secondary market liquidity. And I think it's important to say that we realize that the public markets aren't the only way to achieve that. So in the next couple of months, the UK will be launching, and the London Stock Exchange will be launching a private secondaries platform to enable companies and their employees and their investors to be able to get liquidity without being public. And I think this is an important step. As the LSE, we want to be agnostic about whether you stay private or public. We want to just be able to give you a liquidity platform. So this, if you look in the papers, this is called Pisces, is the framework on which this is based. But that will be in place this summer. And so companies like Revolut, their employees, obviously, this is a decision for Revolut and their management, but their employees could use the Pisces framework under the LSE to be able to get secondary market liquidity. And we think that kind of flexibility is really important. And we realize that not every company is wanting to, needs or wants to go public, but virtually every company needs some form of access to liquidity, and that's what we're going to provide through this innovative framework.
Yeah, I think Pisces, as you mentioned, is certainly a game changer for the UK and an alternative that could be copied in other parts of the world. And for you, Vishal, when we think about capital, your path, the path of Pismo to capital, you went through some interesting moments, and all of them private at the moment. And how did you find the fundraising environment in Brazil, particularly with all the cycles that you went through, the Series B with SoftBank, understanding that Brazil is a different market in terms of VCs sometimes tied to incumbent banks. Can you just share a bit of your experience there?
So yeah, I think, again, thankfully, we are now in a position where, because we are Visa, effectively, I think capital is not really an issue now, but it's a great point. I think when we first raised our seed funding, not really a problem. I think, we were very different and unique in the sense that the product market fit was proven, because our first client was a very large bank, right? So, everyone knew who we were. So seed funding was usually not a problem. Our Series A, again, we basically found investors locally very sophisticated who understood what the total addressable market was and what we were building. We did, I think, our Series B in 2020, right? We started in 2020, we finished it in 2021. That's when the SoftBank, Axel, and Amazon sort of came in. That proved a bit more interesting, again, because we were still at that point largely a Brazilian company. We didn't have an international client base. What I found particularly interesting, and I think it speaks a lot to what Chris was saying, is in terms of private markets, in terms of venture capital, it was interesting that even at that time, right, even though we were sort of effectively, we had set up shop in Britain over here, most of the funding and most of the exposure was either Silicon Valley or sort of Asia at that point, right? There wasn't too much in Britain, right? And I thought that was pretty interesting, right? I didn't see too many, European or British sort of venture cap firms, approach us. We didn't have a good sense of the market over there. So that I thought was interesting. It is sort of always an opportunity to improve. But eventually, I think, as as we started growing, as our word spread, I think fundraising eventually got easier, right? So the way I would sum it up is Brazil, great, not a problem. Largely, again, because, of the client base that we had. Everyone knew who we were. When we started raising internationally, it was interesting. It took a bit of time. I think, from the time we started making the pitch to the time we eventually got funding, I think it took us close to about 7 or 8 months. And all of the sort of VCs were, again, Silicon Valley based. Didn't see too much here, which I think is definitely something to think about.
Yeah, the timing is how long it takes in the end of the day, particularly in this scenario, we're seeing, prices going up inevitably, and probably it's going to be harder and harder. And being placed in the UK probably can bring an edge here. Anything else you'd like to add on Pisces, Chris? Maybe how it's tied to the Mansion House reforms and the Mansion House Compact?
Well, I think it's important to say that the UK, over the last 3 or 4 years, has undergone the most comprehensive capital markets reform in a generation. The FCA and the government have been incredibly innovative and flexible in approaching the issue, basically just trying to make the UK the most competitive capital markets environment that there is in the world. And I think it is actually of any major market. I mean, the US has incredible depth of capital, but is a much more rigid, prescriptive and costly regime to list under. And as a result of that, companies need to be larger to be able to deal with that burden. And so you've seen a movement up the market cap scale in terms of where investors in the US are interested in investing to above $10 billion as kind of a starting point. Whereas growth companies are often going to be below that level and need some, capital provision and a listing venue below that. But I think in addition to that, I think it's important to understand that this is not the entire story. It's very important that you can't just change listing rules. You need to make sure there's actually capital there to actually invest in these companies. And that is the kind of final leg of the reform that's happening in the UK, which is to increase investment by pension funds, but also by the kind of general population. There'll probably likely be some reform of ISAs going forward as well. But really what it means is increased availability of domestic capital to invest in UK equities, and that's what we're going to see going forward. So you combine the regulatory reform of listing and capital markets rules with the increased provision of capital, and that creates a much more conducive environment for growth companies to raise capital. And by the way, that includes companies from all over the world, including Brazil. So when you actually look at, as an example, the largest listings we had in the UK last year were all international companies. That will probably surprise people. So the largest listing on the main market was a French company. The largest secondary listing on the main market was a Hong Kong company. The largest listing on AIM, which is our growth market, was a US company. London is the most international market in the world, and if we are able to increase the flow of capital and also attract international capital too, we can be the hub, especially for fintech, where London probably has the strongest branding of any city in the entire world. So that's what we're looking forward to over the next couple of years.
Good. Well, I think we're all looking forward to it. And When we think about this new economic scenario that we're all living in, and companies that are practically borderless, as Ambassador Patriota mentioned, are now faced with a new economic and trade and investment scenario, we've heard a lot this week about UK PLC, the idea that the UK can offer resources and opportunities for fintech companies to thrive in the UK. But I think a lot about Brazil SA as well, what Brazil can bring to this relationship to actually make the coordination of those two actors flourish even more. And going back to what the Chancellor said in her remarks, she mentioned, for example, the idea of having transatlantic sandboxes during her conversation with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And I imagine that maybe to the other parts of the world, to emerging markets, to Brazil, something similar could come to mind, particularly because over the years we've already developed some really interesting collaborations, from open finance to led the way to what we have today with PIX. So my question to all of you is, what would be the top priorities to actually bring these UK PLC Brazil SA synergy together and make those strategic partnerships flourish even more? I'll start with Nadia first.
It's a good question. I would say there's some limitations still today in Brazilian regulation that kind of, I think, prevents it from being a more international market, that I think, you know, they could develop a bit further. I mean, obviously the development of the regulation locally in the past few years has been incredible, right? But when you look at how the regulation over there is set up, it's not focused on the international community, right? So it's not necessarily focused on how do you bring in externals and foreigners into Brazil and therefore enhance that collaboration across borders. So I do think, so I'll give you some examples, right? Like on the onboarding perspective, right? So any products that are in Brazil, you can't onboard foreigners into these products, right? And so if you're not able to onboard foreign businesses or foreign people in general, people who are not even resident in Brazil because you don't have a CPF or a CNPJ, how are you going to enhance that collaboration, right? And so I think if you want to attract more like cross-border collaboration, more from the UK into Brazil, I think you need to enable that and create that enabling environment. That said, though, I think there's a lot of learnings in how fast the system has developed in Brazil that, you know, I think the UK is definitely looking at that in terms of like a really impressive feat, right? And I think continuously bringing those learnings and enhancing that collaboration to teach kind of the UK and the world beyond how they've done that and how they've really increased uptake locally of fintech products, I think that could be really enhanced.
Carlos?
I echo that, and with respect to, I think on every front, but especially on the second one, right, which is we usually think of more developed markets such as the UK taking their best practices in terms of all types of regulations to emerging markets and middle-income markets, and I think fintech in particular is a case in which Brazil has been tremendously successful and has a lot to show the rest of the world, including the developed world, starting with instant payments and not only the existence of instant payment rails, but being able to develop them in the market and continuing to improve those rails and creating new functionality in a way that's really tremendous. So the Central Bank of Brazil is constantly pushing new PIX functionalities, and that's something that I think the UK regulators could really kind of benefit a lot from in terms of how those frameworks work, how product development works, how it's pushed to the market and kind of forced on participants, which in a certain ways is also very important. And open banking, of course, which is important in the UK. I also understand that it's taken a lot longer to develop than it took in Brazil. And I think those examples from Brazil of how to design, but also how to take to the market these regulatory developments are great kind of lessons for the rest of the world, including the UK.
Absolutely. Open banking started in the UK and through those partnerships went to other parts of the world, and Brazil certainly took the lead, evolving to what we have today with BRICS. Vishal, for you, what is missing there?
Well, I think my answer, given who we are, is going to be slightly different. As I said, we are a technology firm, and so the future of our industry rests on 3 or 4 things, right? One, obviously, is talent. The other is advances in modern computer science. So, for example, quantum computing, cloud, AI, right, and things like that. And for all practical purposes, the UK is typically the birthplace. It gave birth to theoretical computer science, right, to a work that Alan Turing did. Most advanced work in AI is being done here. For example, if you think about DeepMind, right, all of that is happening here. I think one often unexplored area, right, and I think where there's a lot of scope is what I would call technological cooperation, right? So most of the groundbreaking work seems to happen, for example, in the corridor between Cambridge and Oxford, right, and all of those places. I really would like to see more partnership between them and, for example, University of São Paulo, University of Rio de Janeiro, right, Minas Gerais, and all of these places, because Brazil has the scale for these things to be transferred, right, and essentially grown at a much larger scale than what's possible over here, given the population, right? Given the fact that there are so many sort of more developers in Brazil, it could essentially easily become the talent magnet for all of this. If a lot of the technologies that are being developed here were sort of transferred at scale over there. Again, some of it might be my ignorance, but I don't see too much happening over there, and I'd really like to see that happen, because the future of our industry depends on that, right? And for us, that really matters.
So probably sandboxes, transatlantic sandboxes with Brazil would
with
be
much more the real sense of sandboxes, right? I'd love to see sort of a Cambridge, USP sandbox and things like that. Right?
Yeah, that would make perfect sense, yeah. And Chris, when it comes to, I think broader than capital, from your experience as someone who is very close to Brazil as well, how do you see those partnerships and those connections could improve?
Well, what I would say, for instance, is that for our growth exchange AIM, we already have a fast track from the other major kind of developed market exchanges. So if you're listed on the top tiers of, say, NASDAQ, NYSE, TSX, ASX, you actually get a fast track admission to AIM. And I think that there would be scope to explore something like that between Brazil and the UK. I mean, and the point about AIM is actually it is under a different regulatory framework which LSE actually controls. So it's within our power to turn around to have a conversation with B3 and say, if companies listed on B3, then there could be a fast track, admission to AIM, and that would make for a connection between two capital markets and really increase the pool of capital that could be available to these companies. What I would say is B3 actually recently, maybe it's late last year, signed an agreement with TSX. But quite frankly, I mean, just to give you an example, the UK capital markets probably does 3 to 4 times what TSX does every year in terms of capital raising, and probably about the same, probably 5 to 6 times more than Brazil. And we're the top market outside of the US, China and India in terms of the depth of market, in terms of the amount of capital raised. So, the TSX thing, I think that being mostly about small mining companies, quite frankly. I don't mean to malign TSX, but that is their speciality. We can probably see a situation where we can broaden that into other areas such as tech by working together with exchanges like B3 to give access to growth companies, certainly in that small and mid-cap space, where they're not going to get any kind of interest from the US. And I said, that's probably $5 to $10 billion these days where you need to get interest from the US. The vast majority of companies in VC portfolios just do not reach that threshold. And I think there's a bit of naivety there about what is possible in the US. And by the way, having spent so much time in Brazil, I know that Brazilians look to the US very strongly, and there's a big aspiration. What we need to do from a London perspective is create that aspiration for Brazilians and others that the UK in itself can be an aspirational market, enables you to grow. I mean, as an example, we've got Wise on this panel. Wise is listed in London. It was founded by Estonians who were living, and going between Estonia and London. It's a fantastic story, and it shows what we can do as a platform for growth companies, and that's one of the most successful fintech companies that's been founded. So London can be that aspirational venue for fintechs, and I think we just need to get that across more strongly. And the fact we're a much more international market than the US.
I think we share this international aspect and this idea of embracing others and becoming part of our own culture. I think we still have time for one question from the audience. So is anyone interested in questions at this time? Oh, I think there was one there in the back.
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear from all the panelists, so thank you. But my question goes directly to Revolut, if you don't mind. You said you're a company with deep capital and listing is not interesting to you. Maybe I'm reading too much into what you said, but given Pisces is such an exciting opportunity, is that something that you would consider as a company? Does that interest you as a concept?
Okay, so let me first qualify your statement. So I wouldn't say Revolut is a company with deep capital, and listing is not interesting for us. I think the answer was more that liquidity in the short term is not a priority, given the company is already profitable and cash flow positive, right? So we don't really rely on listing in order to continue to fund our growth operations. Pisces, I think, can be a very interesting framework for providing liquidity to investors and to employees while the company decides to list, right? Which I think will be a matter of time, right? So not that it's not interesting, it's a matter of time. But certainly I think it can be a very interesting framework for to provide liquidity to people who already have the stock.
Particularly when you're looking into higher multiples going into a high growing market, like Brazil does bring its advantages, I believe. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, you said higher multiples. So there was actually an article or a report that came out from New Financial, I think it was yesterday. It was reported on in the FT and also The Guardian, which actually talks about the history of UK and European companies listing in the US. I'm actually going to post about this on LinkedIn later, so if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, please do, because I actually write a lot about public markets and also about venture financing as well. What that report basically said was there is no valuation differential between the UK and Europe and the US when you control for differences in growth rate and margin. So I think there is a view that if I go to the US, I will get a higher multiple. Actually, when you drill down and do the analysis, valuation multiple differentials aren't explained by listing venue. They're basically explained by differences in financials and company fundamentals. So I just hope everyone goes away with that one message from today.
It's more about the markets that you're in rather than either NASDAQ or...
Yeah, it's about the quality of the actual company, its ability to generate growth and also turn that growth into cash flow ultimately. And when you control for that, then you can explain the differences in valuation between different markets. It's not about listing venue itself. And certainly companies which have moved or added a US listing have not seen a change in that valuation differential. So it's not like you just add the US and your valuation goes up. The actual evidence, and again, I'm going to write about this afternoon on LinkedIn, the evidence suggests that's not the case. It's really about your company performance ultimately.
Well, I think we can get one extra question here. I can see a hand up in the back. Well, I think I think the conversation was so interesting. We covered so much that there are no additional questions here for the panelists. So thank you all for collaborating, for participating. I'm sure the panelists will be here at the end for a cup of coffee, maybe some pão de queijo for those that haven't tried. I highly recommend it. So thank you so much for all of you. Please, a big round of applause for our panelists.
Obrigado.